A really important quote for Christians that often gets called a manifesto is Matthew 25, and Jesus talks about, I was hungry and you fed me, I was thirsty and you gave me a drink, I was naked and you clothed me, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. And there's also the other piece that sometimes gets called a manifesto, which Mary's song, also called the Magnificat, where it says, the hungry you have filled with good things and the rich sent empty away. And I guess these were some of the passages behind the bishop's comment. The biblical tradition is not only biased to the poor, but warns constantly against too much power falling into the hands of too few. And I just wonder whether the Labour Party hasn't moved its bias from the poor a bit, whether it actually has strayed into that land where it's okay to be mega rich, and just so long as we're letting some of it reach the poor.
I mean, at the end of the day, the Labour Party, one of the founding principles of socialism is equality. You know, we believe in an equal society, or a more equal society. I mean, at the end of the day, we live in a capitalist system, and the capitalist system, the Labour Party believes it needs to be tamed. And inequality is sometimes what you have in the capitalist system, because you need sometimes incentives for people to actually, would you become a doctor, would you become a lawyer if there wasn't higher pay involved? So incentives in the capitalist system are acceptable, but where the problem is if the gap between rich and poor becomes too wide, but also if people are in such poverty that they are effectively imprisoned by their poverty, because this is where there's two separate issues really. There's inequality and there's poverty. And one of the things the Labour Party has always believed in is the redistribution of wealth. We believe in progressive taxation. So, for example, one of the things we would do when we get in is we'd restore the top rate of tax. So one of the things the Conservatives did, didn't they? They reduced the top rate of tax from 50p for those earning over 150,000 to 45p. We would put that back up because we believe in the redistribution of wealth. We believe that money should be taken from those who earn the most, and it should be redistributed to those who need it the most at the bottom of the system. So we've always believed in the redistribution of wealth. And what's interesting, when you actually look at the last Labour government under Tony Blair, it was sometimes criticised actually for not doing enough about inequality, not doing enough about poverty. In actual fact, absolute poverty fell dramatically under the last Labour government. You look at the number of young people in poverty, number of old people in general in poverty, they all fell dramatically. The thing we didn't do enough about was inequality. The gap between rich and poor widened slightly. Not as much as it did under the Thatcher years, because that's when it really widened, but it did widen marginally. And I think we should have done more about that. But the last Labour government did fight inequality. They did reduce poverty. But what the last Labour government didn't do enough was shout about it too much. It was almost their little secret. But what they did do, when you actually look at the figures, is we did tax the more wealthy. And through massive investment in the welfare state, massive investment in the NHS, massive investment in education, money did go down. And, people who are in absolute poverty in the 1990s were actually raised up, and the number of people in absolute poverty fell dramatically under the last Labour government. Unfortunately, what's happened now, of course, is the gap is widening again. Hundreds of thousands of children who were not in absolute poverty in 2010 are now in absolute poverty again. And of course, that is the result of the economic policies of the government, bedroom tax, food banks, poor wages, which we'll obviously talk about later.
Is it also because of the collapse of the banking system?
Well, I mean, this is the debate we have a lot, isn't it, about who is to blame when it comes to, the economic recession that we have, because obviously the Conservatives would argue that the reason that we're having to make these difficult decisions is because of the collapse of the economic system. And obviously they would like to blame the Labour Party. They would like to blame the Labour Party and say the Labour Party led to the economic recession because they spent too much on hospitals and too much on schools. I mean, that's simply not true. When you actually look at it, the economic recession was caused by banks lending irresponsibly. And if the Labour Party did make a mistake in the way it ran the economy, I believe they believed too much this sort of Tory economic idea that Mrs. Thatcher championed, that the free market is always right, that deregulation is always the best way, and that government intervention can never work. And unfortunately, what we did is we allowed the banks to act in an irresponsible manner. You only take the examples of, Northern Rock, for example, which had 125% mortgages. Some banks had self-certificated mortgages. In other words, they would lend you what you said you could afford. And of course, that was very unwise, and when the economic system effectively collapsed in 2008, starting in the United States, that's what led to this massive economic recession. And of course, the Conservatives' narrative is that they were forced to make these huge cuts, which led to this growth in poverty because of Labour's mistakes. But it is simply not true. I mean, the irony is, and I was reading about this today, is that George Osborne, after criticising Labour's economic plans in 2010, effectively, after a short sort of 2-year period when he tried massive cuts and it didn't work, he's pretty much followed our plans. But the growth in poverty that has undoubtedly happened since 2010 is the result of decisions made by the Conservative government.